We all wear masks to some degree. We show up at work with our game face on, we meet friends with our best foot forward, and we navigate the world with a version of ourselves that feels presentable. But for a narcissist, this mask isn't just a tool, it's their entire identity. Their self-worth is built on how they are perceived, and every interaction is an opportunity to reinforce their image. But what happens when there's no one to impress, no one to charm, no one to manipulate? When they are finally alone, the mask doesn't just slip, it crumbles. Behind closed doors, without an audience to mirror their greatness back to them, a narcissist faces an unsettling reality. They don't really know who they are. The identity they project is a performance carefully scripted and rehearsed, designed to earn admiration and avoid shame. But alone in the quiet, when there's no one to validate them, the cracks in that identity begin to show. They might stare at their reflection in the mirror, searching for the confident, powerful persona they've carefully constructed, only to feel a creeping sense of emptiness. That emptiness is terrifying. A narcissist thrives on external validation because it fills the void where self-worth should be. Without someone to reassure them of their importance, they begin to feel the weight of their own insecurities. Doubts whisper at the edges of their mind. Whispers they refuse to acknowledge when others are around. The confident, charismatic person the world sees is in truth a fragile house of cards built on the fear of being insignificant. This is why solitude is so unsettling for them. For most people, time alone can be restorative, a chance to reflect, to grow, to embrace our vulnerabilities. But for a narcissist, introspection is dangerous. Looking inward means facing truths they've spent a lifetime avoiding. It means admitting that their carefully curated image is not as solid as they pretend. So they do whatever they can to escape this silence. Some will turn to distractions, endless scrolling through social media, seeking evidence that others still admire them. Others will replay past conversations, twisting and reshaping them in their minds to reinforce their own superiority. They may even send a casual text, a strategic comment, anything to provoke a reaction that reassures them they still hold influence over someone. Because influence to them is proof of existence. And then there's the anger. When the mask slips, frustration seeps in. Why don't people appreciate them enough? Why aren't they being praised right now? The world should be revolving around them, and yet here they are, alone, unseen, unvalidated. That anger can turn inward, fueling self-hatred, or outward, manifesting as resentment toward those who aren't feeding their ego. Either way, it is a battle between the person they pretend to be and the person they fear they really are. In those moments, shame lurks just beneath the surface. But rather than sit with that discomfort, rather than acknowledge their own vulnerability, they push it away. They might remind themselves of their superiority, rehearse a future conversation where they win, or convince themselves that others are simply too envious to appreciate them properly. Anything to keep from admitting the truth, that without an audience, they don't know how to define themselves. The tragedy is that true confidence, real self-worth, comes from within. It's built on self-acceptance, on the ability to embrace both strengths and flaws. But for a narcissist, that kind of growth feels impossible because it requires something they fear the most: authenticity. And so the cycle continues. The mask slips in solitude, but rather than face what lies beneath, they rush to find the next stage, the next audience, the next opportunity to convince themselves and everyone else that they are exactly who they want to be. For most people, solitude can be a place of peace, a chance to reflect, to grow, and to connect with their inner world. But for a narcissist, being alone is not a place of rest. It's a state of crisis. Their entire sense of self is built on external validation, on the praise, admiration, and recognition they receive from others. Without that steady stream of affirmation, they don't just feel lonely, they feel invisible. And for someone whose identity is constructed around being seen, Invisibility is unbearable. Even when they're physically alone, a narcissist is rarely mentally present in the moment. Their mind is working overtime, seeking ways to manufacture validation even in solitude. They replay past conversations, lingering on the moments when they were praised, admired, or envied. They relive achievements, big or small, as if savoring a meal long after the plate is empty. They might even reimagine interactions, tweaking the details to cast themselves in an even more flattering light. These mental exercises aren't just nostalgia, they are survival tactics, a way to prop up their fragile self-worth. But the past can only sustain them for so long. When reminiscing about admiration loses its effect, they begin to look for ways to generate new validation, even in solitude. They might scroll through old social media posts, reading comments and likes as proof of their importance. They may post something specifically designed to get a reaction, a cryptic status, a selfie, a controversial opinion, all in the hopes of pulling attention back toward themselves. Because if people are reacting to them, then they still matter. For some, the craving for validation becomes more direct. They send a text to someone they know will flatter them. They subtly bring up their own achievements in conversation, even if it seems out of place. They might even manufacture a crisis, exaggerating a problem or playing the victim so that someone, anyone, will rush to reassure them that they are valued. To the outside world, these behaviors may seem manipulative, but to the narcissist, they are acts of self-preservation. This need for validation doesn't just come from pride, it comes from fear. A narcissist does not have a stable sense of self-worth. Unlike a healthy individual who can recognize their value independently of outside approval, a narcissist's self-esteem is entirely conditional. If they are being admired, they feel worthy. If they are being ignored, they feel worthless. There is no middle ground. Their confidence is not rooted in who they are, but in how others respond to them. And when no one is watching, no one responding, no one affirming, they begin to feel like they are disappearing. In these quiet moments, something unsettling happens. Doubt begins to creep in. They wonder if they are truly as special as they believe. They may start to sense the emptiness behind their need for attention, the hollowness of a self-esteem that only exists in the eyes of others. But rather than confront this fear, rather than acknowledge that their worth should come from within, they double down. They chase validation harder. They tell themselves they are better than everyone else, that others are just too blind to see it. They reject any thought that threatens the illusion they've carefully built. But deep down, they know. They know that no matter how much admiration they gather, it never feels like enough. They know that as soon as the applause dies down, the hunger returns. They know that real confidence, real peace, comes from something they haven't yet figured out how to cultivate: self-acceptance. But to admit that would mean acknowledging that they are not, in fact, above everyone else. It would mean facing the truth that terrifies them most, that they are just as human, just as flawed, just as vulnerable as the rest of us. And so the cycle continues. They seek validation, they gather it, they feel powerful for a moment, but when solitude comes again, the emptiness resurfaces, demanding to be filled. And so they search for more admiration, more approval, more proof that they exist, that they matter, that they are enough, even as they continue to avoid the only thing that could ever truly set them free: learning to believe it without anyone else's permission. When a narcissist is alone, their mind does not settle into quiet reflection. Instead, it becomes a courtroom where they are both the prosecutor and the defense. They replay past conversations, re-examine conflicts, and reshape memories, not to seek understanding, but to ensure that they always come out as the hero or the victim, never the villain. Their mind is a theater of self-justification, and every painful truth is rewritten to protect their fragile sense of self. Blame is their first line of defense. If something went wrong in a relationship, if a friendship fell apart, if a project failed, it is never because of their actions. It is always someone else's fault. They tell themselves, if only that person had been more supportive, if only they weren't so jealous, if only they had seen my brilliance instead of trying to bring me down. They twist reality until they are the wronged party, the misunderstood genius, the betrayed friend. This rewriting of history is not just deception, it is survival. If they admit fault, even for a moment, their entire self-identity is at risk of crumbling. The narcissist cannot tolerate being seen as flawed or responsible for wrongdoing. So they revise the past, smoothing over their own missteps and sharpening the faults of others. In their version of events, their cruel words were merely a reaction to someone else's disrespect. Their broken promises were the result of someone else's unreasonable expectations. Their manipulations were necessary to protect themselves from betrayal. The truth does not matter. What matters is maintaining their sense of superiority. This rewriting of the narrative does not just happen in their own mind. Once they have settled on their version of events, they begin to spread it to others. They tell stories in which they are the victim of unfair treatment, the target of undeserved criticism. They paint their former friends, partners, or colleagues as toxic, selfish, or unstable. And because they tell these stories with such conviction, others may believe them. A narcissist's ability to rewrite history is not just for their own benefit. It is a tool for controlling how others perceive them. But the danger of rewriting the narrative is that it distances them from real growth. Most people, when they reflect on the past, see areas where they could have done better, they acknowledge their mistakes, learn from them, and move forward with greater self-awareness. But the narcissist does not grow because they refuse to admit fault. They remain trapped in a cycle of repetition, making the same mistakes over and over, never truly changing because, in their mind, there is nothing to change. And yet, deep down, something unsettles them. No matter how many times they tell themselves they were right, no matter how many times they paint themselves as the victim, there is always a nagging discomfort beneath the surface. They must work constantly to reinforce their version of events because the truth is always waiting, just beyond the edges of their carefully constructed illusion. And truth, to a narcissist, is dangerous. So they drown it out. They repeat their stories like mantras, convincing themselves with each retelling. They avoid people who challenge their perspective. They seek out those who will validate their narrative, people who will reassure them that they are indeed the wounded party, the righteous one, the misunderstood soul. They are not looking for truth. They are looking for confirmation that they do not need to change. And so the cycle continues. The more they blame others, the less they grow. The more they rewrite history, the further they drift from reality. In solitude, where no one can contradict them, the illusion feels strong. But illusions do not last forever. Sooner or later, reality knocks at the door, whispering what they fear most, that they are not who they pretend to be. But instead of listening, they double down, rewriting once again, because to face the truth would mean admitting that the mask they wear is not just for others, it is for themselves. When a narcissist is alone, reality becomes uncomfortable. Without the constant admiration and validation they crave, they feel an unsettling emptiness creeping in. To avoid facing this void, they retreat into fantasy, a world where they are always in control, always admired, always the center of attention. In these private daydreams, they are not just successful, they are legendary. They are not just liked, they are adored. They are not just powerful, they are untouchable. For some, this fantasy world is built on visions of success and dominance. They imagine themselves walking into a room and commanding instant respect. They see themselves on stage delivering speeches to thunderous applause. They daydream about future achievements, winning awards, gaining wealth, becoming famous. They don't just fantasize about success, they see themselves as inherently deserving of it. The fact that they have not yet achieved these things is not due to a lack of effort or talent, but because the world has not yet recognized their greatness. For others, the fantasy is about personal relationships. They imagine old friends and ex-partners regretting the way they treated them, longing to have them back. They construct elaborate scenarios where those who doubted them are forced to admit they were wrong. They replay past conflicts but change the outcome, ensuring that in the retelling they always have the last word. In these fantasies, they are never rejected, never outshined, never overlooked. But fantasy is not just about inflating their sense of self, it is also about avoiding discomfort. The narcissist does not want to sit with feelings of insecurity, shame, or failure. They do not want to acknowledge moments when they were wrong or reflect on why certain relationships have fallen apart. Instead of confronting these emotions, they escape into a world where none of those things exist. The real world, with its complexities and imperfections, is abandoned in favor of a carefully crafted illusion. Technology only fuels this escape. Social media becomes a stage where they can curate their image, post selectively, and receive instant validation. They craft online personas that reflect their ideal selves, showcasing only the moments that reinforce their superiority. They may even seek out shallow relationships, brief interactions, casual flings, or one-sided conversations where they remain the dominant figure. Anything to avoid real vulnerability, real connection, and real self-reflection. Yet, no matter how grand the fantasy, reality always intrudes. The narcissist cannot live in their imagination forever. At some point, the applause fades, the validation runs out, and they are left once again with the same gnawing emptiness. The fantasy, while powerful, is only a temporary escape. It soothes for a while, but it does not fill the void. And so the cycle repeats, escaping, inflating, avoiding, because facing the truth feels too unbearable. What they fail to realize is that true confidence, true fulfillment does not come from external validation or grandiose dreams. It comes from self-acceptance, from the willingness to acknowledge flaws and embrace growth. But the narcissist resists this truth because it threatens their carefully built illusion. To admit that they are not perfect, that they are not above others, this is a reality they are not yet ready to face. And so they remain trapped in the fantasy, using it as both a shield and a prison. It keeps them safe from the discomfort of self-awareness, but it also keeps them disconnected from real life, because while fantasy may offer temporary relief, it can never replace the depth, authenticity, and meaning that only come from living in the real world. For most people, solitude is an opportunity for rest, reflection, and growth. It is a time to reconnect with oneself, to process emotions, and to find meaning in the quiet. But for a narcissist, solitude is something far more terrifying. It is a confrontation with a void they spend every waking moment trying to escape. When the distractions fade, when the applause dies down, when there is no one left to impress, the emptiness creeps in, and it is suffocating. At first, they may not recognize it as emptiness. It disguises itself as boredom, as restlessness, as an urge to pick up the phone, turn on the TV, or scroll endlessly through social media. Anything to drown out the silence. Because in the silence, something unsettling stirs. The realization that without an audience, without admiration, they don't really know who they are. Their identity has been so carefully constructed around external validation that in its absence, they feel weightless, untethered, unreal. So they search for distractions. They may replay past conversations, imagining themselves as the center of attention, reliving moments where they were admired or envied. They may mentally rehearse future scenarios, crafting the perfect comeback, planning the next move to regain control, picturing a world where everyone finally sees their greatness. But even these fantasies only work for so long. Reality still waits in the shadows, whispering what they refuse to hear. This isn't real. You are alone. And when they can no longer outrun it, the weight of their isolation begins to settle in. It is not just physical solitude that haunts them. It is emotional loneliness. They may have people around them, friends, partners, colleagues, admirers, but deep down, They know that these relationships are built on performance, on manipulation, on control. They know that if those around them saw the truth, the insecurities, the self-doubt, the cracks in the mask, they might not stay. And so despite all their efforts to be seen, they feel more invisible than ever. This emptiness is not just loneliness. It is a hunger, a craving for something they cannot name. It is the aching need to be understood, to be truly known, but the terror that if they were, they would not be enough. And so they cycle through their usual coping mechanisms, seeking validation, rewriting the past, escaping into fantasy, desperately trying to fill a void that cannot be filled with admiration alone. Because admiration is not connection. Praise is not love. And deep down, they know it. But admitting this would mean admitting that something is missing. It would mean acknowledging that the carefully crafted persona they have built is not enough to sustain them. It would mean facing the painful truth that they have spent a lifetime avoiding, that they are not superior, not untouchable, not beyond the needs and struggles of ordinary people. And that realization is unbearable. So instead of facing it, they lash out. For some, this means turning their pain outward. They grow resentful, blaming others for their loneliness, convincing themselves that people are unworthy of their time, that no one truly appreciates them. They may push people away, testing their loyalty, creating conflict just to feel some sense of control. Anger, after all, is easier to tolerate than vulnerability. And if they can convince themselves that their isolation is someone else's fault, they can avoid the far more painful question, what if it's me? For others, the pain turns inward. Self-doubt creeps in, whispering what they have tried so hard to suppress. What if I'm not as special as I think I am? What if I'm not enough? But rather than sit with these feelings, they drown them in distractions, impulsive decisions, reckless behavior, anything to remind themselves that they are still in control. They will do anything to avoid the terrifying possibility that the emptiness isn't caused by a lack of attention, but by something much deeper. What makes this emptiness so consuming is that it cannot be filled the way they wish it could. No amount of external praise, success, or admiration will ever be enough. They could have the entire world applauding them, and still the silence of solitude would expose the same hollowness. Because what they crave is not something the outside world can provide. It is something they must cultivate from within. Authenticity, self-awareness, and the ability to be truly vulnerable. But vulnerability is their greatest fear. And so they remain trapped in the cycle. They chase validation, build their image, seek out attention, only to find themselves alone with the same gnawing void once the noise dies down. They tell themselves that the next achievement, the next relationship, the next moment of recognition will be the one that finally makes them feel whole, but it never is. Because true fulfillment does not come from being admired. It comes from being real. And that is the one thing they have never allowed themselves to be. The tragedy is that the emptiness is not a punishment. It is an invitation. It is a call to look inward, to face the fears they have buried, to build a self-worth that is not dependent on the approval of others. But answering that call requires courage, and courage requires vulnerability. And so for now, they will do what they have always done: run, distract, deny, until one day when they are too exhausted to run and they finally realize the only way out of the emptiness is through it.